The HSC, the health and social care, is 200 billion. And the entire budget for pay bill for centralised civil servants is 11 billion. So just the scale here is so wildly different that unless you're willing to look at those big spending departments, it's hard to see where the massive savings come from.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Today we are talking about the size and the shape of the state, and in particular, how public spending could be cut back. It is now widely expected that the Chancellor will use her upcoming budget to increase taxes, but she could as well, or alternatively, cut public spending in order to meet her fiscal rules. There are certainly calls for that from some parts of the political spectrum. So today we are going to look at how much money does the government raise, where does it spend it, and how is that due to change over time? Why is this a particularly difficult moment for this particular government to cut spending? But more broadly, if any government, this one or the next one, wanted to cut spending, where could it look to do so? To talk about all of this, I'm joined by Tom Waters and Ben Zaranko, who are both Associate Directors here at the IFS. Tom leads our work on income and welfare, and Ben leads our work on all things public finances. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
So Ben, let's start by painting a picture of how much money the government spends overall, and broadly, what's it spending it on?
So on our behalf this year, the government will spend a little more than £1.3 trillion, so a bit over 1,300 billion. That is around 44% of GDP, or it's just over £19,000 per person. So, these are big amounts. Some of this is spending on stuff, spending on hospitals or providing services to people or, defending our borders or for the armed forces and so on. Some of it is payments to people, so it's pensions or it's welfare benefits. So to split it down a little bit more granularly, about a quarter of all government spending is on what we might call welfare or social security. That's about £4,600 or £700 per person each year. If we broadly think about day-to-day spending on public services, so this isn't investment in buildings and stuff, this is paying for public sector workers and buying drugs in the NHS and textbooks for schools and all the rest of it. That is about £8,500 per person, so a little bit less than half of the total. Then you've got investment spending, a little over £2,000 per person. That's your investment in bridges and infrastructure and pylons and all the rest of stuff like that. About £1,600 per person on debt interest. So
that's shocking.
Not a trivial sum. About 8% of all government spending, much more than it used to be. And then the remainder we should not get into. It's lots of awkward accounting items or very small line items that make up the big total. So I guess the big thing here is about £19,000 a year that government spends on average for each person.
But then a fun fact for people, despite austerity over the 2010s, the size of the state has jumped up in recent years.
Yeah, so actually the size of the state now, weirdly enough, in terms of if you measure it as government spending as a share of the economy, is roughly where it was during the financial crisis in terms of ballpark figures. It then came down from about 45% of GDP to a little bit less than 40% on the year before the pandemic. It then shot up quite obviously, and then it's fallen back down. So we're currently about 5 percentage points of GDP above where we were 5 or 6 years ago, which is
that's quite a lot.
That's a big change. Yeah, it's a big change. Quite a lot of that is things like debt interest. Some of it is healthcare spending, but we're basically spending more almost across the board.
Great. So let's unpack some of those numbers, shall we? So Tom, let's start with welfare. We should probably first just unpack. Ben gave us a number of like £5,000 on average. Of course, it varies hugely across different people. So unpack for us the different types of welfare spending we do and how they're changing.
Yeah, and I think an important part of what we mean by welfare here is we're including pensioners, we're including the state pension. That's a really big part of what's going on, not always what people have in mind when they think of welfare or think of benefits. So if you look at overall spending for working age people, it's about 140 billion a year, and for pensioners, 175 billion. So both of these obviously pretty chunky numbers, but a little bit more for pensioners. In the category of working age spending, working age welfare spending, what's been going on in recent years, we've talked about before on this podcast, there's been this big increase in the number of people getting health-related benefits, disability benefits, and that is pushing up spending. But the kind of bigger picture, if you look at the last 10, 15 years, is spending on the rest of the system, the non-health related part, has come down. And so our spending now on working age welfare, if you look at it as a share of GDP, is kind of about where it was in the mid-2010s. So when you look at that kind of overall thing, it doesn't look like there's a tremendous amount going on, but basically that's a combination of the non-health related part of the system being squeezed a bit during the latter half of the 2010s, and then the health related part starting to really increase.
And that increase is due to keep going quite strongly.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important fact about this overall picture of like fairly little change is kind of going on there is that we've got a big increase, continued expected increase in the number of people getting health-related benefits. If that continues to go up, obviously that's going to push up the overall number as well, unless the government made big savings from the rest of the system.
Okay, so that's working age welfare. Before we talk about how we might cut that, state pensions and in particular the triple lock is another big chunk of spending, another spending stream that is due to rise pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So triple lock says that your state pension goes up with the highest of CPI, inflation, earnings, or 2.5% each year. And so that kind of inevitably means the state pension has to rise in real terms over time, because at worst it increases with inflation, and so over the long run it becomes higher in real terms. It also becomes higher relative to people's average earnings, which kind of crudely you can think of as where the tax revenue to pay for it comes from, and so that means that over many years that really accumulates to significantly more spending. In a given year, perhaps it's not a huge deal, but over the course of years or decades, it really adds up.
So I think some people will hear these big chunky numbers and the fact they're increasing quickly and quite reasonably ask, well, if the Chancellor wants to raise 10, 20, 30 billion, say, wouldn't it be quite easy to just trim back those spending plans, trim back disability or trim back the state pension and quite quickly get what she needs?
Yeah, I think there's some sense in which the answer is yes. Like, a lot of the simplest thing, take the state pension, be a good example. You could just have a lower state pension. You could reduce the amount that you get each month. That would, in one sense, that would work. That would save a bunch of money overnight. Obviously, it might be politically extremely difficult. But I think in that sense, yes, it's technically easy. It's not like someone's got to really figure out how to do it. I think what becomes a challenge is trying to save money in a way that is politically feasible and doesn't, generate some other kind of horrible distortions to the system. That's where things start to get a bit more difficult. So
if the Chancellor did want to tackle the working age welfare system and try to cut it, broadly, what options would she have? Yeah,
so for working age welfare, I basically think of what the system is doing is supporting kind of three groups. So it's supporting children or families with children. It's supporting renters, low-income renters, and it's supporting people with disabilities. So you pretty much would have to look at one of those groups to try and save some money. So, for example, the government tried over the summer to try and trim back the disability benefit system, make it more difficult to qualify for the main disability benefit. Something like that. That would be one route to go for saving money. Or in the world of benefits for children, we already have the 2-child limit, for example. That's a saving. If the government undoes that, of course, that will push up welfare spending. But I think you kind of have to think about which of these buckets are we going to try and target. Perhaps the other kind of overarching one is how quickly do we take away universal credit as your earnings rise. So at the moment, you lose 55p for every extra pound after tax earnings you earn. We could make that faster. So as you earn more, your universal credit is withdrawn faster and faster. That potentially could save quite a bit of money. But that would also weaken the incentives for those who are on benefits to increase their earnings.
Just on the state pension triple lock. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. I mean, there is a world in which, I think it's politically extremely unlikely, a world in which the government could tackle that, remove the triple lock, put something more sensible in place, and actually not necessarily save much money in the short run, but make bigger savings in the longer run, and that will be good for credibility reasons.
Well, I guess there's two things going on. Is that there's the short term versus the long term, where the impact of the triple lock accumulates over time and it sort of ratchets up and it gets baked. If you get a big increase one year, it's baked in next year, and then any increases apply to that higher amount. So the costs do accumulate over the years and decades. But also, in expectation, actually the triple lock doesn't really cost anything. If you think inflation is going to be at 2% forever, which is if the Bank of England is doing its job properly, in theory it should be. Obviously not that simple. If you think earnings are going to grow faster than inflation, then you should expect the triple lock to go up in line with earnings, right? Or 2.5%. The problem is the triple lock becomes a problem when things are volatile and inflation spikes to 10% and suddenly you're increasing the state pension by 10%. Or there's one year when earnings do terribly, but you still have to protect the state pension. If we think the world is going to progress in a nice, simple way, triple locks almost cost free in expectation. So if the Chancellor was to announce it, it would get scored in the budget as saving very little. So the actual paper savings, when the Treasury produces its table of measures at the budget, wouldn't save much at all. And for the political trouble it would cause, I can see why a Chancellor might be a little bit nervous about that. But there would be a big gain in terms of the long-term savings, and I think a big gain in how it would be seen as a willingness to tackle a really intractable problem and do something that improves our long-term fiscal position.
Tom, before we move on to other spending, one thing we might want to pick up on is Motability. So for reasons you've suggested, it's going to be hard for the government to cut back on welfare spending. They tried with disability, they couldn't get it past the backbenchers. Actually, there are a call from the backbenchers to increase spending on children through removing the two-child limits. The idea of cutting there seems tough. But there is this scheme called Motability that they might be willing to fiddle with. So tell us what Motability is, and then we'll talk about that.
So if you get the main disability benefit for working age people, PIP, you're assessed on how well you're able to move around, your mobility. And if you're assessed as having particularly significant mobility needs, which about half of PIP claimants are, then you can essentially give up that part of your PIP payment for in return for having a car for a certain period of time. And that's through this scheme called Motability. And now I think it's kind of an unusual setup. It's essentially a monopoly. You can only give up that payment directly to the Motability organisation. You can't do it to any other one. And perhaps an important aspect here is that the cars that you get are not subject to VAT, and the car insurance you get is not subject to insurance premium tax. And so in that sense, there's quite a big tax saving that you get if you get a car through this system. So the government could take a look at this, could take a look at making it more difficult. They could make it so that those tax exemptions are removed, for example, or they could take a look at the monopoly, essentially, that Motability have. And those might be ways to make savings. I think that we wouldn't be talking about gigantic numbers. It's difficult to say exactly how much, but there might be some amount that could be used.
It's important to distinguish there between the two elements that you set out, right? That on the one hand, we're allowing disabled people to basically trade their allowance for the lease on a vehicle. And that was going to help a lot of people who need vehicles, haven't got the upfront money to buy something. So the leasing element of it, you might think is a good idea. But the big tax breaks that come with it are much more questionable. So they could leave in place the structure of allowing people to trade their allowance for a lease on a vehicle, but not have it come with the juicy tax breaks. That would save some money. I suspect if they do it, it'll be more of a totemic thing to show that they're serious about spending, or that to free up a little bit of money to spend something else as opposed to a big saving.
It's not massive, right? The tax relief costs money, but otherwise, it's sort of, does the government really care if someone gets their PIP payment and goes and spends it on groceries versus trading in the PIP payment and getting a car in return? It's sort of budget neutral apart from the tax relief.
Yeah, I think that is an important thing, because part of what's attracted a lot of attention is that you can get potentially quite nice cars, and that's come under some criticism. But I think, if it's just PIP claimants are happy to give up their payment, as you say, and the Motability scheme is able to make all the numbers add up to lease it to them, then that doesn't seem that should be something that's directly the government's concern. I guess the issue comes if, there's a sort of they're only able to do that because they have this sort of quasi-monopoly that's...
Yeah, or I suppose if you think it's attracting more people to try really hard to get onto disability benefits because they would then qualify for this scheme. But I think we shouldn't get too bogged down on this, right? Because it's a small
exactly.
chunk. The bigger point to me, it seems, on working age welfare is, if we wanted to save big sums, and we did this in the 2010s, you can just reduce the generosity of payments, right? We froze them in cash terms for a few years, and then we increased them with a different measure of inflation that meant they weren't going up as fast, and that saved a lot. Now, clearly that has impacts on people's incomes, on people's lives, on poverty and inequality and all those things that governments often care about. But that's a pretty certain way to save money. The other way to try and save money is limit who's eligible for these things. So that was the big debate we had earlier this year about disability benefits and sort of almost like a severity threshold. How many points do you have to get on these assessments to be eligible? Which is maybe the sort of thing you might want to be thinking about at this point if you think the system isn't working well, but it's a little bit more uncertain how people will respond. Often you want transitional protection for people who are currently in the system, and it's difficult to raise big sums very quickly. I think that's the big choice. Do you think that's a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that, through freezing benefits during a lot of the 2010s, about half the 2010s, switching measure of inflation, as you say, the government saved huge sums of money without an enormous amount of political cost. It's interesting if you compare it to the so-called bedroom tax, which caused, there was so much attention. It was actually like a really pretty small benefit saving compared to these freezers. I think it's reducing the values of the benefits you get, at least if it's done in a kind of a steady way, can actually be done. It can actually save significant sums of cash. So I guess we should say at some point, we think freezing things for long periods of time is a really bad way to make policy. But the point of making slow and steady reductions in the values of these benefits is feasible, it seems.
It's also no one sees an overnight hit to their benefit payment, right?
That's the attraction.
If it's frozen or increasing more slowly, same reason why threshold freezes don't trigger the same amount of vitriol as rate increases.
I think a takeaway on welfare is that there's nothing inevitable about the size of the welfare bill. Governments could absolutely cut it back in any way, in various different ways. And actually, it could even do things that cut it in future, stop it rising in future. Before you even start doing cash cuts today, you could stop it rising as quickly. But this particular government's going to find that difficult, partly because of its political preferences and partly because it's tried some things already and hasn't got through. Ben, let's talk about day-to-day spending. So you had some big numbers up the top. Let's just first paint a picture for people about, broadly, what are the big departments and who's getting most of the government spending?
So I'm going to again I'm going to be a bit liberal with my rounding because I think that I'm not going to get into the decimal places. Government this year is allocating about 500 billion, give or take, to departments to spend on public services. Now, it doesn't include everything, but it includes the most things that you think about as public services. And about 40% of that, about 200 billion, is the Department of Health and Social Care, basically the NHS in England, is how you can think about that. Now,
so that's the single biggest department. This is huge. The NHS is huge.
That is just massive. 200 billion is just massive. The NHS employs about 6 million people across the UK, right? It's 8% of the economy is government spending on
That's
healthcare.
a good statistic. 8% of the economy is healthcare.
Yeah, so it matters, how efficiently that money's spent, how productively it's spent, whether those people have good working conditions. It matters for the macroeconomy. So that's the biggest one. Then about another 20% of the total is education. So that's the biggest one within there is schools, but you've also got university grants and things like that. You've got further education colleges, early years. So that's about 95 billion this year. There's then about 40 billion which is sent to the Scottish government to spend on things in Scotland that are devolved. Again, a big one will be the NHS, but other stuff that's going on in Scotland. Then about another 8%, about 40 billion, is the MOD. So that's not all of the MOD budget. They also spend money on building aircraft carriers and and fighter jets and stuff.
This is weapons and soldiers.
Weapons and soldiers, yeah. Then about 20 billion on the Home Office. So that's police. That's most of police. That's border force and immigration security and things like that. And then you're starting to get into much smaller numbers, right? So you've got grants to the Welsh government and the Northern Irish government. Those things are basically determined by a formula based on what you spend elsewhere in England. Then you've got the grants to local government, are only about 14 billion now. But, councils are struggling. They provide lots of local services that people rely on. About 12 billion day-to-day spending on justice. That's the courts, that's prisons, that's like legal aid. And you've got about 10 billion for Department of Work and Pensions. That's like your job centres, that's your work coaches. 8 billion on transport, things like subsidies for buses. We're getting into much smaller numbers now. So the Foreign Office, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which includes a big chunk of the aid budget. It's only about 8 billion. HMRC, 6 billion. So you start trying to make big savings to the HMRC budget. We're going to be more efficient in how we handle calls from people querying their tax bill or whatever. You can cut half of the HMRC budget, cut it to 3 billion. That's it's a drop in the ocean. Actually the HSC budget this year is 203 billion. Actually, just my rounding error is the same size as a 50% saving to HMRC. So basically, you want to save big money from departments, you've got to be looking at health, education, defence. Basically, people always think about all these pen pushers in Whitehall costing a fortune. Now, there are a lot more pen pushers in Whitehall than there used to be, but the total administration budgets, this is like the central costs of running the state effectively, is 15.5 billion this year. The pay bill's 11 billion.
On a spend of 500 billion.
I'm chucking a lot of numbers here, but the one I want you to keep in mind is that DHSC, the health and social care, is 200 billion. And the entire budget for pay bill for centralised civil servants is 11 billion. So the scale here is so wildly different that unless you're willing to look at those big spending departments, it's hard to see where the massive savings come from.
But actually, even if Rachel Reeves was willing to look at those departments, at this point in time, it would be hard for her to do that, partly because the government just had the spending review back in summer, where there were all the negotiations across departments, across the cabinet table about how to allocate the budgets. That's kind of all happened and been sealed. She could reopen those and renegotiate those. That would be politically difficult and not ideal in the sense that you want to give budget certainty to these departments so they can plan. But actually, that's not the only pressure, right? Because there's also lots of other long-term pressures, meaning that they're sort of pushing upwards on spending.
Yeah, so there's a practical question of if you've just painstakingly agreed with all your cabinet colleagues and all the different departments, budgets for the next 3 or 4 years, and you've said, okay, go out and make your hiring decisions, your investment decisions, plan your services on this basis, and you did that in June after some quite aggressive political briefing in the press, arguing with the Home Office and all the rest of it. Do you really want to open those up again? So there's just a practical question about, say, actually, sorry guys, I know we agreed that, but I'm coming back to trim 2% off your budget. That just undermines, if you're a prison governor or you're a school head teacher and you've been told this is your budget for the next few years, it clearly undermines the stability and certainty that this process is supposed to provide. Now, these things aren't set in stone. They haven't been carved into a tablet and placed on a mountaintop. They're never to be touched again, but we could revisit them. It's just that there will be practical concerns in the short term. But then looking further ahead, yeah, you could try and say, okay, we've agreed things for the next 2 years, but we're going to then, after that, we're going to have to really trim things back. Absolutely, we could. But I think just saying, salami slicing budgets and saying everyone's going to get 3% less, but we're going to expect you to deliver the same things and just be more efficient, you are going to eventually run out of road with that sort of strategy. And I think we have to think a little bit more, maybe we can get into this, think a bit more about, well, what actually is it that we were previously hoping to do that we're just not going to do anymore? Or other similarly difficult questions about how you can realistically make savings. I guess one thing I should say here is about £300 billion of government spending every year, which is not far off a quarter of the total, is paying salaries for public sector workers. So if you want to make savings, employing fewer people or paying them less is one clear and obvious way how you go about doing so.
But that would also have ramifications in terms of the quality of the people you potentially would get. So that's not costless either. So you'd have to have fewer people or potentially...
It's all bound up together. If you no longer want to... if we decide we don't need to spend currently the new NATO target as part of the alliance is to spend 3.5% of GDP on defence. We currently spend more like 2.5%. But if we decided we were no longer going to do that, and we actually decide we don't need to have a big armed forces anymore, we can employ fewer soldiers. Or if we think the NHS is actually, we're only going to provide dentistry services to people on very low incomes, for example, we can employ fewer NHS dentists. But you have to pare something back to allow those cuts to happen. Otherwise, I think you're just asking for trouble.
I mean, it does depend though, because I guess you might think, well, look, if we had 9 applicants for every job for a public service job, then presumably at that point you could pare back spending, pare back wages, and actually think, no, we're going to be able to provide like pretty much the same things we were before. Isn't that right? So it sort of depends, like kind of how much we want to, how many people we want to hire, and are the wages kind of commensurate with that? Is that the right way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I think that's the right way of thinking about it. You want to make sure you can attract the number of staff you need with the skills you need, and ideally high quality staff. Because just having 9 applicants for the job doesn't mean there's 9 people equally capable of doing it. If we just opened up applications to be a top surgeon for 150 grand a year, I'm sure lots of people would sign up, but I'm not sure I'd want all of them doing my heart bypass. But yeah, and I think you can look at some bits of the public sector where we can compare to commensurate jobs in the private sector, comparable jobs, and say, do we think we're maybe overpaying here? But I think there's other places where probably public sector is maybe underpaying in terms of, is it struggling to attract or retain really high quality people? Some parts of the top end of the civil service maybe, or doctors having international options where they can move to Australia or Canada and look much more. So yeah, that is the right way to think about it. And it might be that, for example, we don't need to provide quite so generous pensions in the public sector to attract the people we need, and we could save some money there. Those are sort of conversations we should be having. It shouldn't just be the magical, don't worry, we'll trim everyone's budgets by 10% and everything will be okay.
But on the efficiency, I think some people at home might be shouting at us that we could make efficiency savings because the government, everyone's got their favourite story about some inefficiency in the public sector. So I guess it's worth spelling out for people that actually there are already some pretty punchy productivity assumptions baked into the numbers. But it is true more broadly that with something like the NHS, we should be thinking about how we can deliver healthcare more efficiently. And if we could get that up, that would be a saving in some sense.
Yes, absolutely, completely. The public sector could be more efficient. The IFS could be more efficient, I'm sure, if we went around. But clearly anyone who interacts with the public sector, I think it's rare to come away thinking like that is a perfectly oiled machine.
The pinnacle of efficiency.
That is operating at maximum 100% efficiency. It could not possibly be improved. Clearly, there are gains that could be had. And I think if you look at the NHS in particular, on the government's own estimates, depending on which bit of government you ask, the NHS is something like between 5 and 8% less productive than it was before the pandemic. And we've done a podcast about this, we've written about this. There are things we should be trying to do to undo that. Over the next few years, the government spending review is already based on achieving productivity improvements that are around 5 times the average of what we managed in the 2 decades prior to COVID. So we managed 0.2% per year between 1997 and 2019. And then we're now planning to do 1% per year. Now, 1% per year might not sound like a lot, but two things. One, three things actually. Yeah, one, it's punchy relative to the past. 2, economy-wide productivity growth isn't exactly exploding in the UK. So we know aiming for 1% a year is still, relative to that, pretty good. And also, the nature of public sector work makes it hard because, if you're helping an elderly person to, get dressed in the morning or changing a dressing on a wound, there's only so many ways to do that. It's quite hard it's not like there's the scope for huge productivity gains like there is in something like advanced manufacturing. And so we have to be a little bit realistic about there's only so many ways to police a Derby Day football match or to stand guard on an aircraft base somewhere where the RAF has aircraft bases. There are limits to how much more productive you can be in a labour-intensive public sector job, which isn't to say we shouldn't try and eke those things out, and maybe technology and AI will change the equation a little bit. But I think that what the government's actually already aiming for is pretty good.
Can I ask that? Because I think one thing that I think people find difficult to understand, particularly with respect to NHS, then maybe it's a general principle, is, over the 2010s, we had real terms increases in NHS spending. And I guess the general perception, at least, is that the quality of the service wasn't massively increasing, at least. And so there seems to be this kind of, this norm that you need meaningful real terms increases every year just to tread water. Would you say that's right? And so I think from the outside, I think, that seems pretty puzzling, right? If you gave real terms increases to the IFS budget every year, we'd hope we'd be able to produce more papers. But that doesn't seem to be the case with the NHS. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a few things going on there. Over the 2010s, if you just look at take money out of the equation for a second, just look at the number of staff and the number of buildings and then how much stuff the NHS was doing. It was actually getting more productive over time. And it was, for each member of staff, it was doing more operations and procedures, basically. It's a simple way to think about it. That's fallen off a cliff now, and that's the problem we need to try and undo. But for a while, that was the case. Yeah, its budget was going up over time, and it's going up faster than inflation. Not as fast as it had done over the previous 50 or 60 years on average, but it was still going up. But the NHS is also being asked to do more, right? For one, we keep inventing new medical technologies that people want access to. There's new drugs available that people get very upset if they're told they can't have because it's too expensive. You have campaigns in the newspapers. You have a growing elderly population demanding more care. So it's not just about how much you're spending, it's also what you're being asked to deliver. So if waiting times are getting longer in A&E or for your operation, it's not just because of how much the NHS's resources it's got, it's how many other people are in the queue in front of you, right? And there's just more people joining those queues and turning up at A&E and wanting care. They seem to be more sick on average with more interacting complex conditions that make them more expensive to treat. And that's particularly accelerated, we think, maybe post-pandemic, or at least some signs of that. And so, yeah, it's not just it's about what you're being asked to do and how many people are demanding services as well as the resources you've got. But that's just something that in a world where people are living longer and people are surviving into adulthood with conditions they wouldn't previously have survived with, those are things we should celebrate. That does place additional pressure on services. That's not just the NHS. You've also got like children's social care or adult social care for young adults with very severe learning disabilities, for example, has gone up quite a lot. But that's because there are more of those people with those conditions and those needs than in the past. Like in some ways, it's a success story. It just adds pressure to the government budget.
But is it, just to be optimistic for a second, is one source of potential optimism that the NHS is still less productive now than it was before the pandemic, and therefore fairly recently we could be more productive? Surely we could just get some of that back, and that would help us if we could manage how to do that.
Yeah, I know. And the NHS's own analysis suggests that its productivity in hospitals is growing at about 2.5% per year. So it's getting there. We'll get back eventually towards the back end of this decade, and hopefully we can continue to grow from there. There's a lot of focus on this in government now, which I think is welcome. And so, yeah, I think we should be demanding, especially as our taxes rise, we should be demanding more efficient and productive public services. I just think a dose of realism there about whether that's going to be the thing that gets us out of this trap and gets us out of the need to ever raise taxes again, and means that we can start having more money in our pocket and better public services, and government can bring borrowing down. I don't think the numbers add up for me.
I mean, we often bemoan, as you've alluded to, Ben, politicians who just make these sweeping statements like, we'll cut X billion, without really telling us where they're going to cut it. But there have been some examples recently of people spelling out more specifically ideas for cuts, including from Policy Exchange, which is, for those of you who don't know, Policy Exchange are a right-leaning think tank.
Yeah, and it was, there's plenty of reports around saying, here's how we could raise this much more in tax, and here's the specific measures you could do. We do some of that ourselves, and because we think the Chancellor's going to raise taxes, talking about how she could do so. But it's sort of a breath of fresh air actually to see a group of authors from Policy Exchange actually saying, we want to spend less, and here's how we think we should do it. Not through magical thinking, but through tangible measures. But I can read a few of them out, and you get a sense of why. That's the sorts of radical thinking I think you need to be engaging with. So they advocate for freezing the state pension for 3 years and then increasing it just with CPI inflation. So that's getting rid of the triple lock and bringing forward the state pension age. And they reckon that you could eventually raise a bit more than 20 billion or cut more than 20 billion.
So that's 20 billion from pensioners.
Yeah, exactly. They also then want to means test more pensioners' benefits, save about 3.5 billion there. So that includes things like prescriptions and other forms of benefits we provide to pensioners. So that's a little bit extra, but bearing in mind the backlash to the attempt to means test winter fuel, so we shouldn't view that as being trivial or easy. They want to save about 30 billion more from working age welfare, again by freezing most benefits and then increasing them more slowly afterwards. And then thinking about eligibility to try and reduce, talking about person independence payment earlier, they want to try and reduce the number of people who are eligible for that, presumably limiting the degree to which people with certain conditions can access those sorts of benefits. They want to introduce charges in the NHS for GP appointments. They want to restrict pay bargaining, which means effectively lower pay awards for nurses and doctors and other NHS workers who do sometimes quite like going on strike. And charging for various other things, and with a longer term view to replacing the NHS with what they call a social insurance system. They want to reduce the size and cost of the civil service. I reckon they can save 2 billion there. Scrap basically loads of green policies, including like Great British Energy and boiler upgrade subsidies and things like that. Save about 6 billion. Cut how much we spend on international aid to very close to zero, save about another 7 billion there. They want to reduce the number of university places by 30%. They want to stop having universal free school meals. They want to get rid of the new childcare subsidies that the government introduced a couple of years ago and save about another 5 billion there. That's a good example of something the state didn't used to do, but has recently started doing. They're saying the state should stop doing that. But that's good. That's the sort of thing, that's the sort of debate we should be having if you want to do this. Anyway, I could go through the full list, but the point is that a lot of these involve either quite a notable reduction in the generosity of things like the state pension and working age benefits, plus the state charging for things it currently provides for free, plus the state just stopping doing some stuff, and the state doing some stuff, but not for everyone anymore, just for the worst off. But that's a willingness to reckon with the reality of, in a world of upwards pressure on defence, an ageing population, that's what it would mean. They want to cut about 3% of GDP from spending. And I think that's what it would mean. I think that's refreshing honesty. And we should be debating those particular policy options.
Yeah, I think whether you love or hate those particular proposals, the fact they're specific and they are spelling out what you would need to do, I think is the thing that we're saying refreshing. Actually, I think as we're recording this podcast, Nigel Farage is giving a speech about the reform platform. I think they're also now making more specific pledges about what they would like to cut, which I think includes foreign aid, or on this point about determining who gets benefits. I think they want to stop certain people who aren't citizens of the UK getting benefits, or start having higher charges for the NHS for people who aren't citizens here. So again, more specific ideas about how you actually start paring back the size of the state. I mean, finishing on the kind of back to this Parliament, I mean, Tom, Ben, do you think we'll see any meaningful changes to spending plans this time?
I'd be surprised if we saw anything in this budget. What do you think?
I think we might see something
small,
something around the edges. So one thing, if the Chancellor's, as it seems to be based on the reporting in the last 12 hours, who knows what the next 12 hours will suggest, but that she's sort of scrabbling around and thinking, looking for lots of smaller measures that might add up to a big amount. You could pare back what's planned to be spent on public services later in the Parliament. You could cut a couple of billion off that without it looking too ridiculous. So that sort of thing might come up. I think there might be a couple of sort of symbolic measures of attempts to cut back on spending they view as wasteful or unnecessary, or to try and send the message that they're willing to be tough on spending. But I think that they'll be a very small part of the overall consolidation package.
I mean, and the government have said a few times there's been an indication that they might want to go back for more welfare savings. Obviously, didn't go amazingly in the summer, but maybe have another go. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if over the next year, 2 years, we see something in that direction.
But they have their TIMS review, and isn't that explicitly not trying to find saves? They've got a big review of personal dependence payments, and explicitly that big review is not going to find savings. Is that right?
So the point of the review is not to find savings, but from personal dependence payment.
But it might do by happy accident.
Well, I think they made a big deal about co-producing, which was probably a word that many people haven't heard before, but co-producing the TIMS review with disabled people, so getting disabled people involved in doing it. I guess it might be tricky to deliver a set of policies which are going to make meaningful cuts to disability benefits, I think, if the goal is to get disabled people on board at the same time. But there's nothing to stop them just kind of layering on other welfare cuts around that. So TIMS review is just about really assessing the way that the PIP system works.
And I guess there's a point here is that the government wasn't actually trying to spend less on disability benefits than we spend today, right? It was trying to slow the rate at which these things are growing.
Yeah, slow quite marginally, actually.
Yeah. So,
it would still been growing.
It would still be growing by a lot, just by a few billion less.
Yeah, so it was over the course of the 2020s, OBR expect that we'll spend about an extra 30 billion on working age, disability and incapacity benefits, health-related benefits. And the goal of the original welfare bill was going to shave off something like 5 billion off that. I think it depends a little bit how you count.
Go by 25 rather than 30.
Up to 25.
I do think that is important context, and you could imagine them coming back with further steps to try and bend that curve downwards a little bit. The other area where I wonder if we'll see something this autumn, though maybe not the next year, is we see something similar on children with additional needs or with disabilities or special educational needs in schools, where that spending is also going up very, very quickly. And you might see again, I doubt it will be framed in terms of we're trying to cut the send budget, but it might be reforming the system, thinking about who's eligible for what the right form of support is, which might have the effect of saving some money at some point. I think what's difficult with all of these things is it's hard to save lots of money quickly because often you feel the need to protect those who are already in the system, often very vulnerable groups, or people who you don't want to take money off overnight. So maybe not big sums in this parliament, but that might be somewhere where we see a genuine attempt to actually reduce government spending.
But if they've learned anything from the disability cuts or the failed disability cuts, it surely is that get the reform worked out properly first, have a plan that you can actually get through parliament before you try and rush out some cuts and have to U-turn on them.
Yeah, don't do it to chase a particular number in the OBR spreadsheet.
Yeah, always the right answer. As I always don't do that, never do that. But with that, let's draw this to an end, shall we? I mean, we start with the question of could the government spend less? And the answer is very obviously yes. The government spends a huge amount of money. It could very obviously spend less, and there are very many ways in which it could spend less money. It will be particularly difficult for this particular government at this moment in time to cut spending, partly because they've tried to spend some spending cuts and they didn't get them through past their backbenchers, and partly because they've just this summer settled their big spending review, and reopening that would be tricky. More broadly, if any politician wants to cut spending, we need to be thinking not just about how much money you want to cut, but actually where you would cut. What is it the government would stop doing? Which people would stop getting support or get less support? What would you start charging for or means testing? And importantly, thinking not just about spending today, but spending in the future. If you want to stop some of these spending increases happening, then thinking about, again, what is the government not going to do in future that it's currently planning to do? But with that, let me say thank you to Ben and Tom. Thank you to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, do share it with your networks. And I should remind you that actually, if you've enjoyed thinking about the size of the state, we have a Be the Chancellor tool on our website that allows you to fiddle around with how much the government spends and taxes, and allows you to have a go at what you would do if you were in charge of the spending levers. And if you would like to support us in producing this podcast and other things, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. We'll see you again next time.